In the summer of 1980, Margaret Whitmore seemed to have everything. A sprawling estate in Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhood, a successful husband who owned 3 thriving construction companies, and a lifestyle that turned heads at every charity gala. But beneath the polished exterior, her marriage was crumbling. What started as divorce proceedings would spiral into something far more sinister, involving a missing fortune of over $4 million and a web of deception that wouldn't unravel for more than 3 decades. The case went cold almost immediately. No suspects, no clear motive beyond greed, and no trail leading anywhere meaningful. Financial records disappeared. Witnesses grew quiet, and the money seemed to evaporate into thin air. For 34 years, investigators hit dead ends at every turn, until 2014, when a man named Robert Chen walked into the Fulton County Sheriff's Office with a manila envelope containing documents that would change everything. What he revealed wasn't just evidence. It was a confession that implicated someone who had been hiding in plain sight since the day the money vanished. Someone who had built an entirely new life on a foundation of stolen wealth, assuming no one would ever connect the dots. But time has a way of exposing buried secrets, and this case was about to prove that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually collapse under their own weight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret and Thomas Whitmore had been married for 18 years when the cracks began to show. Thomas had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single crew doing residential renovations in the early 1960s and expanding into commercial development by the mid-70s. His companies handled everything from office complexes to shopping centers, and the money flowed accordingly. Margaret, a former debutante from a prominent Atlanta family, had adapted to the wealth with practiced elegance. But success had come with a price. Thomas worked 16-hour days, traveled constantly, and had grown increasingly distant. Margaret suspected there were other women, though she never confronted him directly. Instead, she began planning her exit strategy. In March of 1980, she quietly retained one of Atlanta's most aggressive divorce attorneys and began documenting Thomas's assets with forensic precision. The Whitmores owned properties across 3 states, held investments in dozens of ventures, and maintained multiple business accounts that Thomas managed personally. Margaret's attorney estimated the total marital estate at approximately $8.4 million, making it one of the largest divorce cases in Georgia at the time. Margaret wasn't just seeking alimony, she wanted half of everything, plus punitive damages for what she claimed was emotional abandonment and financial deception. Thomas received the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in April, delivered to his main office while he was reviewing blueprints for a new hotel project. According to his secretary, he read through the documents without expression, placed them in his briefcase, and continued with his scheduled meetings. He didn't mention the divorce to anyone that day, not even his business partners. What Thomas did next would later be scrutinized by investigators, financial analysts, and forensic accountants. Over the following 6 weeks, he began systematically liquidating assets and transferring funds between accounts. Some moves appeared legitimate, standard business operations that any construction company might execute. Others raised questions that wouldn't be asked until much later. On May 15th, Thomas cashed out a series of certificates of deposit worth $1.2 million. He claimed the funds were needed to cover payroll and material costs for upcoming projects, but company records showed no corresponding expenditures. 3 days later, he sold a commercial property in Marietta for $800,000 in cash, telling his partners that the buyer preferred immediate settlement to avoid financing complications. Margaret's attorney grew suspicious when routine discovery requests were met with delays and incomplete documentation. Bank statements arrived with pages missing. Property deeds couldn't be located. Investment portfolios showed transactions that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify the true value of holdings. By June, it was clear that Thomas was either hiding assets or moving them beyond the reach of the divorce proceedings. The breaking point came on June 23rd. Margaret arrived at the couple's primary bank to withdraw funds from a joint account that typically held around $50,000 for household expenses. The account was empty, not just reduced, but completely drained, with no record of where the money had gone. When she demanded an explanation, the bank manager showed her withdrawal slips bearing Thomas's signature, all dated within the previous week. That evening, Margaret confronted Thomas at their home. According to her later testimony, he was calm, almost detached, as she accused him of stealing money that legally belonged to both of them. He claimed everything he had done was within his rights as the primary account holder and that she would receive her fair share once the divorce was finalized. But Margaret had been tracking his moves through her attorney's investigation, and she knew the numbers didn't add up. Financial records would later show that Thomas had systematically emptied nearly every account under his control. Joint savings, business operating funds, investment portfolios, and even a trust account set aside for their daughter's college education. The total amount moved or liquidated exceeded $4.2 million, representing roughly half of the couple's total worth. The money didn't simply disappear. It moved through a carefully planned sequence of transfers, conversions, and investments that would take forensic accountants years to fully understand. Some funds were converted to cashier's checks made out to shell companies that existed only on paper. Others were wired to accounts in banks that had no clear connection to Thomas's business operations. A significant portion was invested in bearer bonds, untraceable instruments that could be cashed by anyone who possessed the physical certificates. Margaret's attorney filed an emergency motion with the court, requesting an immediate freeze on all marital assets and demanding that Thomas provide a complete accounting of his financial moves. The motion was granted, but it came too late. By the time investigators began tracing the money, most of it had already been moved beyond their reach. Thomas appeared in court on July 8th, accompanied by his own legal team. He claimed that his recent financial activity was entirely legitimate, driven by business necessities and investment opportunities that couldn't wait for the divorce to be finalized. He provided a sworn statement listing his current assets and liabilities, showing a net worth of approximately $3.8 million. The missing $4.2 million was explained as business losses, failed investments, and necessary expenditures that had reduced the marital estate. Margaret's team presented evidence that contradicted nearly every claim in Thomas's statement. Bank records showed transfers to accounts he hadn't disclosed. Property transactions were documented that he claimed never occurred. Investment statements revealed holdings he had sworn under oath that he didn't possess. The judge ordered Thomas to appear for a deposition and provide complete documentation within 30 days. Thomas never appeared for that deposition. On July 21st, his secretary found a resignation letter on his desk, stating that he was stepping down from all business responsibilities effective immediately. His personal belongings had been cleared out. His company vehicle was parked in the lot with the keys under the floor mat, and his home phone had been disconnected. Margaret returned to the family estate that evening to find it empty. Thomas had removed his clothes, personal papers, and several pieces of valuable artwork. He had also taken the family safe, a heavy unit that had been bolted to the floor of his home office. Neighbors reported seeing a moving truck at the property 2 days earlier, but no one had paid close attention to what was being loaded. The case was immediately referred to the Fulton County Sheriff's Department as a potential criminal matter. Detectives interviewed Margaret, Thomas's business partners, employees, and anyone else who might have insight into his disappearance. What they discovered was a man who had been planning his exit far longer than anyone realized. Months before the divorce papers were served, Thomas had been quietly establishing connections that would later prove crucial to his vanishing act. Investigators discovered that he had opened accounts at banks in 3 different states, none of which were connected to his construction businesses. The accounts were opened under variations of his name and used post office boxes as mailing addresses, creating a paper trail that was deliberately fragmented and difficult to follow. More troubling was the discovery that Thomas had been liquidating assets in small increments for nearly a year. Real estate holdings were sold through third-party brokers. Investment accounts were closed and reopened elsewhere, and business equipment was transferred to newly formed companies that existed only on paper. Each individual transaction appeared routine, but together they formed a pattern of systematic wealth extraction that had gone unnoticed by everyone, including his business partners. The construction companies themselves became part of the puzzle. Thomas had structured his businesses in a way that made him the sole decision-maker for all financial matters. But he had also created layers of subsidiary companies and holding entities that obscured the true ownership of assets. When investigators tried to determine what belonged to the construction companies versus what belonged to Thomas personally, they found themselves navigating a maze of paperwork that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. One of Thomas's business partners, a man named Vincent Torres, provided crucial insight into the months leading up to the disappearance. Torres had worked with Thomas for over a decade and considered him a close friend, but he admitted that Thomas had become increasingly secretive about financial matters in the spring of 1980. Important documents that were once shared openly were suddenly restricted to Thomas's personal files. Business meetings that Torres had always attended were held without him, and Thomas began making major financial decisions without consulting the partnership agreement. Torres recalled a conversation in early May where Thomas had mentioned wanting to expand operations into Florida and the Carolinas. At the time, Torres thought it was typical business ambition, but Thomas had been unusually vague about the specifics. He spoke about opportunities that required immediate action and mentioned having contacts in place who could facilitate rapid expansion. Torres now suspected that Thomas had been laying groundwork for his disappearance under the guise of business development. The investigation also revealed that Thomas had been converting assets to forms that were easily transportable and difficult to trace. In addition to the bearer bonds, he had purchased rare coins, precious metals, and even valuable artwork that could be moved without triggering the financial reporting requirements that banks were required to follow. A coin dealer in downtown Atlanta confirmed that Thomas had made several large purchases in the months before his disappearance, paying in cash and requesting that the transactions not be documented in detail. Margaret provided investigators with additional pieces of the puzzle. She had noticed changes in Thomas's behavior that extended beyond their marital problems. He had become obsessed with maintaining detailed records of everything, except his financial activities. He kept meticulous logs of business appointments, travel schedules, and even personal activities, but he had stopped sharing information about money with anyone, including the accountant who had managed the family's finances for years. More significantly, Margaret revealed that Thomas had been receiving phone calls at odd hours from people she didn't recognize. The calls often came late at night or early in the morning, and Thomas would take them in his private office with the door closed. When she asked about them, he claimed they were business-related, but the timing seemed strange for construction industry communications. She suspected he might have been coordinating with accomplices, though she had no proof. The timeline of Thomas's activities in his final weeks painted a picture of careful orchestration. He had systematically closed out business commitments, transferred ongoing projects to his partners, and even arranged for his personal affairs to be handled in his absence. His lawyer received a power of attorney document that gave specific instructions for the dissolution of certain business entities, and his accountant was provided with signed forms authorizing the closure of various accounts. What made the disappearance particularly sophisticated was how Thomas had managed to liquidate such a large amount of wealth without triggering immediate suspicion. Banking regulations in 1980 were less stringent than they would later become, and Thomas had exploited loopholes that allowed him to move money in ways that were technically legal but ethically questionable. He had also taken advantage of the fact that many financial institutions operated independently, making it difficult for investigators to get a complete picture of his activities across multiple banks and states. The bearer bonds alone represented over $2 million in untraceable wealth. These instruments, which functioned essentially like cash, could be redeemed by anyone who possessed the physical certificates, making them impossible to track once they left the issuing institution. Thomas had purchased them through different brokers over several months, paying with funds from various accounts and ensuring that no single transaction was large enough to attract attention. Detective Ray Morrison, who led the investigation, later described the case as one of the most methodically planned disappearances he had ever encountered. Thomas had anticipated nearly every aspect of the legal and investigative response to his actions. He had prepared explanations for his financial moves that were plausible enough to buy time, established alternative identities that could be activated when needed, and created enough confusion in his business affairs to make immediate pursuit nearly impossible. The search for Thomas expanded beyond Atlanta within weeks of his disappearance. Federal authorities became involved due to the interstate nature of his financial activities and the possibility that he had fled across state lines. Banking records were subpoenaed from institutions in multiple states, and law enforcement agencies were alerted to watch for anyone matching his description attempting to access accounts or conduct large transactions. Despite these efforts, Thomas seemed to have anticipated the investigative response. The accounts he had opened in advance were accessed sporadically and in small amounts that didn't trigger reporting requirements. The post office boxes he had rented were checked infrequently, and when they were accessed, it was always by different individuals who appeared to be acting on behalf of someone else. Thomas himself remained completely invisible, as if he had simply ceased to exist. Margaret was left to navigate the aftermath alone. The family estate was seized by the court as part of the divorce proceedings, but with Thomas's assets frozen or missing, there was little left to divide. The construction companies continued operating under Torres's management, but without Thomas's financial backing and business connections, they struggled to maintain their previous level of success. Within 2 years, all 3 companies had either been sold or dissolved. The criminal investigation remained active for several years, but leads gradually dried up as Thomas's trail grew colder. Occasional reports would surface of someone matching his description in various cities across the country, but none could be confirmed. The case was eventually transferred to a cold case unit, where it joined hundreds of other unsolved disappearances that had stumped investigators despite extensive resources and effort. For Margaret, the financial devastation was only part of the trauma. She had lost not just her marriage and her wealth, but her sense of security and trust in the people closest to her. The man she had lived with for 18 years had revealed himself to be capable of elaborate deception and calculated betrayal. She spent years wondering how long he had been planning his escape, and whether any part of their relationship had been genuine. The case became a cautionary tale within Atlanta's legal and business communities. It highlighted vulnerabilities in the financial system that allowed someone with sufficient planning and resources to essentially disappear with millions of dollars. It also demonstrated how easily a person could exploit the trust and assumptions of those around them to carry out complex criminal schemes. But the story was far from over. Thomas Whitmore had vanished completely. taking with him over $4 million and leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. For 34 years, it seemed like the perfect crime, executed with precision and sealed by time. No one imagined that decades later a stranger would walk into a sheriff's office with documents that would finally expose what really happened to the missing fortune and the man who stole it. Robert Chen had lived quietly in Marietta for over 2 decades, working as an accountant for a mid-sized logistics firm and keeping to himself. His neighbors knew him as a polite but reserved man who maintained an immaculate garden and drove the same Honda Civic for 15 years. What they didn't know was that Chen had been carrying a secret that connected him to one of Atlanta's most infamous unsolved crimes. In the spring of 2014, Chen's world began to unravel when his wife of 23 years filed for divorce. The proceedings started amicably enough, but as their attorney began cataloging marital assets, inconsistencies emerged that made Chen increasingly uncomfortable. His wife's legal team questioned financial records that didn't align with his reported income, property investments that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone in his position, and a safety deposit box that contained items he couldn't adequately explain. The pressure intensified when forensic accountants were brought in to trace the couple's financial history. Chen realized that his carefully constructed life was about to be exposed, and the truth he had buried for decades would inevitably surface. Rather than wait for investigators to uncover his past, he made a decision that would finally bring closure to the Whitmore case. On a humid Tuesday morning in June 2014, Chen walked into the Fulton County Sheriff's Office carrying a manila envelope that had been sealed for over 3 decades. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes that painted a complete picture of Thomas Whitmore's disappearance and the fate of the missing $4.2 million. But Chen's revelations would prove even more shocking than anyone anticipated. Chen's real name was Robert Whitmore. He was Thomas's younger brother, a man who had lived in Thomas's shadow for most of his adult life and who had been secretly recruited to help orchestrate one of the most elaborate financial deceptions in Georgia's history. For 34 years, Robert had maintained his false identity, living on money that rightfully belonged to his brother's ex-wife, while Thomas himself had died just months after fleeing Atlanta. The brothers had grown up in rural Tennessee, sons of a construction worker who struggled to provide for his family. Thomas was the ambitious one, the natural leader who left home at 18 to seek his fortune in Atlanta. Robert was quieter, more methodical, with a talent for numbers that Thomas recognized could be useful in business. When Thomas's construction companies began to thrive in the 1970s, he brought Robert to Atlanta to help manage the financial side of operations. Robert worked behind the scenes for years, handling bookkeeping, tax preparation, and routine financial administration. He was competent but unremarkable, the kind of employee who kept detailed records and followed instructions without question. Thomas trusted him completely, which made Robert the perfect accomplice when the divorce proceedings began, and Thomas realized he needed help moving his wealth beyond Margaret's reach. The plan they devised was more complex than investigators had ever imagined. Thomas would publicly disappear, creating the impression that he had fled with the missing money and was living somewhere under an assumed identity. Meanwhile, Robert would gradually assume control of the hidden assets, using carefully prepared false documents to establish himself as Robert Chen, a legitimate businessman with no connection to the Whitmore family or the missing fortune. The transformation began months before the divorce papers were served. Robert obtained forged identity documents that established his new persona, complete with a fabricated employment history, educational credentials, and personal references. He rented an apartment under his new name, opened bank accounts, and began building the paper trail that would support his false identity for decades to come. When Thomas began liquidating assets in the spring of 1980, Robert was coordinating the movement of funds through a network of intermediary accounts that he had established in advance. The money was never intended to disappear permanently. Instead, it was being systematically transferred to investments and accounts that Robert could access once enough time had passed to make the connection seem impossible. The bearer bonds that had puzzled investigators were purchased by Robert using funds that Thomas had converted to cash. Rather than being sold immediately, they were stored in safety deposit boxes that Robert rented under his false identity, creating a hidden reservoir of wealth that could be accessed gradually over time without attracting attention. The rare coins and precious metals followed a similar pattern, purchased by Robert and stored until they could be safely liquidated years later. Thomas's actual disappearance was carefully staged to create maximum confusion and misdirection. On the night he vanished from Atlanta, Thomas drove to a remote location in the North Georgia mountains where Robert was waiting with camping equipment and supplies. The brothers spent their final weeks together living rough in the wilderness, avoiding populated areas while they finalized the details of Robert's new life and Thomas's permanent exit from the world. According to Robert's confession, Thomas had been suffering from a heart condition that he had kept secret from everyone, including Margaret. The stress of the divorce proceedings and the physical demands of executing their plan had taken a severe toll on his health. On August 14, 1980, just 3 weeks after his disappearance, Thomas suffered a massive heart attack while the brothers were camped near a remote lake in Robin County. Robert found himself alone in the wilderness with his brother's body and no way to explain the situation without exposing their entire scheme. He made the decision to bury Thomas in an unmarked grave deep in the forest, far from any hiking trails or development projects that might lead to accidental discovery. Thomas Whitmore, the man who had supposedly vanished with millions of dollars, had actually died within a month of his disappearance and had never enjoyed a single day of his stolen wealth. Robert returned to Atlanta and began the delicate process of establishing his new identity while maintaining the appearance that Thomas was still alive somewhere. He sent occasional postcards and made brief phone calls to business associates, always from different locations and always with explanations for why Thomas couldn't meet in person or provide more detailed contact information. The communications were designed to keep hope alive that Thomas might eventually return while buying Robert time to complete his transformation. The most challenging aspect of the deception was managing the financial assets that Thomas had accumulated. Robert couldn't simply withdraw large amounts without triggering investigations, so he developed a patient strategy of gradual liquidation and reinvestment. He sold the bearer bonds in small increments over several years, used the proceeds to purchase legitimate investments under his false identity, and slowly built the foundation of wealth that would support his life as Robert Chen. By 1985, Robert had successfully established himself in Marietta with a modest accounting practice and a reputation for reliability and discretion. He had liquidated most of the stolen assets and reinvested the proceeds in real estate, stock portfolios, and business ventures that generated legitimate income. To outside observers, he appeared to be a successful but unremarkable professional who had built his wealth through careful planning and conservative investments. The irony of Robert's situation was that he had become genuinely skilled at managing money and building wealth through legitimate means. The accounting practice he established grew steadily, his real estate investments performed well, and his stock portfolio benefited from the bull market of the 1990s. By the time his marriage began to deteriorate in 2014, Robert had accumulated substantial assets that were entirely separate from the money he had stolen decades earlier. But the forensic investigation triggered by his divorce had begun to expose inconsistencies that couldn't be explained by his reported business success alone. Bank records showed deposits in the early 1980s that didn't correspond to any documented income source. Real estate transactions were dated to a period when Robert Chen supposedly had limited resources, yet the purchases were made with cash. Investment accounts showed initial funding that preceded his claimed business success by several years. Robert realized that sophisticated financial analysis would eventually trace his wealth back to the period immediately following Thomas's disappearance. The technology and investigative techniques available in 2014 were far more advanced than anything that had existed in 1980, and records that had once seemed safely buried were now accessible through digital databases and cross-reference systems that could identify patterns across decades of activity. The decision to confess wasn't driven entirely by fear of exposure. Robert had lived with the guilt of his brother's death and the knowledge that Margaret Whitmore had been left destitute while he prospered from her stolen money. He had followed her life from a distance over the years, learning that she had struggled financially after the divorce and had never fully recovered from the betrayal. The weight of that knowledge had grown heavier as he aged, and the prospect of his own legal troubles finally provided the catalyst he needed to tell the truth. Robert's confession included detailed maps showing the location of Thomas's grave, financial records documenting exactly how the stolen money had been moved and laundered, and personal letters that Thomas had written but never sent, expressing regret for the pain he was causing Margaret and uncertainty about whether their plan would succeed. The documents painted a picture of two brothers who had been overwhelmed by circumstances and had made choices that destroyed multiple lives, including their own. The revelation that Thomas had been dead for over 30 years fundamentally changed the nature of the case. What had appeared to be a successful escape and the perfect crime was actually a tragedy that had claimed Thomas's life and trapped Robert in a web of deception that defined the rest of his existence. The missing fortune hadn't funded a life of luxury in some distant location. It had been used to create a prison of lies that Robert had inhabited for decades, always fearful that his true identity would be discovered. Margaret Whitmore, now in her 70s and living modestly in a retirement community, learned of Robert's confession through a phone call from Detective Morrison, who had remained involved with the case even after his official retirement. The news brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief, answering questions that had haunted her for over 3 decades while also confirming that the man she had once loved had been capable of elaborate betrayal right up until his death. The legal implications of Robert's confession were complex. The statute of limitations had expired on most of the financial crimes, but the murder charges related to Thomas's death and the ongoing fraud associated with Robert's false identity remained prosecutable. Federal authorities became involved due to the interstate nature of the money laundering and the use of fraudulent documents across state lines. Robert's cooperation with investigators was complete and detailed. He provided access to safety deposit boxes that still contained some of the original stolen items, bank account information for assets that had never been discovered, and documentation of every transaction that had occurred over the 34 years since Thomas's disappearance. His goal was to make full restitution to Margaret while accepting responsibility for his role in the crimes. The recovery of Thomas's remains became a priority for both law enforcement and the family. Robert led investigators to the remote burial site in Robin County, where forensic teams confirmed the identity through dental records and personal effects that had been buried with the body. Thomas Whitmore was finally laid to rest in a proper ceremony, attended by Margaret and a few surviving business associates who had wondered about his fate for decades. The financial restitution process revealed the full scope of Robert's deception and success at managing the stolen wealth. Assets that had been worth $4.2 million in 1980 had grown to over $15 million through careful investment and reinvestment over the intervening decades. After legal fees, taxes, and penalties were deducted, Margaret received a settlement that exceeded $8 million, finally providing her with the financial security that had been stolen from her 34 years earlier.